Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Brothers and sisters, welcome to the Encounter program, sponsored by the Broome County Council of Churches. I'm your host, Mark Kimpland, the pastor at the Endwell United Methodist Church. This fall, we have done several interviews, very intriguing, interesting interviews with clergy in the area, many of whom are either retired or approaching retirement. And I find these types of interviews fascinating. Fascinating to have the ability to dive into the lives of pastors and clergy and to learn the lessons that they've learned and to hear of those lessons over their many, many years in pastoral ministry. So we continue that theme, and I'm excited to have our guest this morning who is nearing retirement, and I can't wait to hear about it as to how near that might be. But our guest today is the Reverend David Maslin. He is the Director of New Faith Communities in the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church. Dave, welcome to the Encounter program. Glad you're here.
Nice to be here, Mark.
Glad we could pull this off. That's quite a title you got there.
Ridiculous. Yeah.
A lot of things going on there, but thank you again for doing this. Just a little side note before we get started, Dave, you were actually the first one that welcomed me as the district superintendent of the Binghamton district as I made my transition to Endwell some 7.5 years ago now. How time flies while you're having fun.
Yes, it does.
Yes. So let's start kind of at the beginning, if we can, and share with our listeners and our viewers and such a little bit about your call to ministry. How did this all start? this longevity of your career in pastoral ministry.
Yeah, it's really a very powerful part of my story is my call. If I had to sum up my call in one word, the word that I would use would be incremental. And it's more to do with God's patience with me than anything else. I was extremely introverted as a child, and we went to church every Sunday. But I experienced most of the social settings in the world as a child, hugging the leg of my father. I remember being in school and just the teacher would ask a question and I would know the answer and I would break out in a sweat just thinking about raising my hand to give an answer that I was confident of. It was just a really painful thing for me to speak in social settings. So my mother told me when I was 8 years old that she had a dream that I was going to be a pastor.
Wow.
For many, many years after that, I ran from that idea every chance I got. And but when I was in college, early in my college years, I did experience a very strong sense of call to be in ministry. And because of that, volunteered to lead a Bible study at a youth a prison, kind of a minimum security prison for teenagers. And there was a bunch of boys that I sat with for a whole semester and did Bible study, and it was the most meaningful thing I had ever done in my life. And so, during those college years, I felt strongly called, and I said, yes, God, as long as I can just work with youth, I'll do it. So I started out that way and worked for a couple of years in college as a youth director part-time while I was in school. And then out of college, took a job as a director of youth at a United Methodist Church in southern New Jersey. And it was while I was there working with youth that the senior pastor, Russ Shivers, a very significant person in my call, continually talk to me about seminary, gave me opportunities to preach when he was going to be away, gave me opportunities to lead Bible studies, not only for youth, but for adults as well. And those experiences and, not just his voice, but many other voices saying to me, Dave, you're missing your calling. God's given you gifts for this. finally I decided to go to seminary. So that was kind of the beginning story of just that sense all along that there must have been somebody better than me, for this. God somehow was kind of missing something here. And I argued with God for a long time, but God was very persistent, and I'm grateful now.
Now, when you're talking about your college experience and your undergraduate work and such things, what did you go to college for? What were you seeking as your major and all of that?
Yeah, well, like a lot of young people, I changed many, many times. I
Okay.
started as, I was good in math. I thought I wanted to be an architect. I started in that, and I took how you got to take those general classes the first couple of years of college, and took a psychology class and just loved it, and ended up taking more. And so I shifted my major to psychology at one point. And then I took a class in Christian education from a guy that just inspired me in so many ways to go deeper spiritually. And it was that class really where he encouraged us to learn spiritual disciplines and do journaling and to practice fasting and where I went deep enough, I think, in my own relationship with God that I was able to start to hear God better. So by the time I was graduating from college, I actually graduated with an education degree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, did you have a strong spiritual formation growing up and such things from childhood, and the church was a part of your life and all of that?
I grew up in the Union Center United Methodist Church, and it was definitely a church that was very intent on helping people grow in their faith, their walk with Christ. And so, yeah, we had a great youth group and many opportunities, not only for us as youth to kind of go to youth group and have fun, but to actually lead. The church had a couple of different youth services every year, and there were opportunities for us to use our musical abilities in church. And I remember, being in Sunday school as a teenager and having a very deep conversations about faith and about God. So, yeah, it was very formative. My years growing up, my faith was definitely planted in me at a young age, no question.
Oh, what a blessing. What a blessing.
Yeah.
So you eventually find yourself in seminary. I always like to ask those that are about to retire or those that are retired, can you share a little bit about your seminary experience? We all have our stories.
Yeah. And so my wife and I had our children when I was a youth director in Toms River, New Jersey. So we were parents very young, and it was after our second child was born that I announced to my wife that I decided to go to seminary. I was not really popular with my wife at that point. So seminary, I ended up going to Princeton Theological Seminary, a good Presbyterian school, and actually had a very good experience there. I was serving as a pastor part-time at the same time. And I think it was a very, there was an opportunity every single week as I was writing sermons and preparing Bible study lessons and things to practice what I was learning at school. So it was kind of that praxis of, thinking, learning theory, and then putting it into practice and realizing what was effective and fruitful and what really wasn't. And so I think that was probably what made my seminary experience richest, was that I was serving a church at the same time, and made some good friends and met some really interesting professors with all kinds of different ideas. And it definitely broadened my theology, and I think prepared me to be in ministry with a wide variety of people. I was really grateful for that, and
Sure.
Taught some skills to give me more confidence as an introvert to be able to get up in front of people and be able to speak. The preaching department at Princeton back then was extremely strong, and so that was a great experience.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I wanted to kind of go down the rabbit hole a little bit with you, if I could. How did that? Was it seminary? Was it undergrad work? Was it a combination of the church and all of that kind of helped you with the being introverted and such things? Can go and raise his hand to someone who's standing in the pulpit preaching on Sunday.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that, as an introvert, one of the things I've learned is that it's not so much about your shyness as it is where you get your energy from. And yeah, there was the terror of getting in front of people. Also, the exhaustion of being with people that has never gone away. And so my experience of preaching has been interesting. And I would say one of the things that confirmed my call was that when I actually stand in front of a group of people to speak, I feel different. I feel as if the Spirit is giving me what I need, but then when I'm done, and I after I greet people at the door and I go home, I need a nap. I mean, just absolutely exhausted from being with people as an introvert. So I would say I've learned skills over the years and that give me confidence, but there is not an occasion, even today, for me to get up in front of a group of people to speak or to preach when I don't still have that feeling in my gut of almost like I'm going to be sick to my stomach. It's always there. It's always been there. But like I said, when I actually stand and begin speaking, God somehow gives me what I need for that.
Yes. Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Friends, our guest this morning is the Reverend David Masland, who is the Director of New Faith Communities in the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church. So you eventually graduate from seminary with all the answers and all the wisdom of a wise sage, and ready to set the world on fire. What happens next after that?
Well, actually, I spent I guess one of the things that happened too, we were talking about what is it that kind of developed me, and my years in youth ministry actually were very formative, and there were two things that happened to me, I think, while I was working with youth. One was kind of the deep relationships that I developed with the parents of teenagers who had volunteered to help with the youth ministry. And so those relationships helped me to realize the potential of ministry to see people's lives change. So there would be somebody that would, I would ask the parents, we just need somebody to help with youth ministry. And somebody would, there'd be a couple people that volunteer right away. And I'd say, well, we still need one more. And somebody would very hesitatingly come forward and say, I guess I'll help. I mean, I can drive my car, it was just kind of the beginning step for them, a step of faith for them. And as I gave them more and more responsibility and asked more of them, I saw something happen in them. I saw the Spirit of God working in them. And so I think one of the really powerful things that I learned in that time of ministry was that the most meaningful part of ministry is actually seeing people, seeing God work in the lives of people, not only to bring them to faith, but for God to actually bring out something in them that they never ever expected was there. Just as God had done the same thing in me, in fact, every layperson is called to ministry. And the most joy I ever got in ministry over the years was actually seeing God work in the lives of people, seeing them step forward, seeing them discover their gifts, seeing them offer their gifts for the good of the world, and all of a sudden making this huge impact on the lives of other people. So, as I think about my ministry, that thing that I learned doing youth ministry with the parents of teenagers is something that has just carried all the way through for me. And so those relationships, that's what I would say about my ministry, relationships with people. You think as a pastor, it's your sermons that are going to have the most impact. In fact, what I would say is the sermons are just a piece of what God is doing, and a very small piece of what God is doing in people's lives. And it's our relationships with people we model for them our spiritual lives, as we walk with them in Bible study and walk with them in praying for them, and kind of walking with their family as they go through the good and the bad over the years. That you can see God working and changing their lives and working through them to make the world, to make their families a better place, to make their workplaces a better place. And so I would say, as I think about my ministry, that's one of the most meaningful things. The other thing that comes to mind is the incredible privilege it is to be a pastor and to be invited by people into the sacred spaces, right? These, these moments, these kind of really tender moments when people are so vulnerable and somehow they trust you to invite them into that space and talk to you. If you really ask good questions and you shut up long enough to listen, people will actually open up their stories to you. And so times of grief, when you're sitting with a family that's lost a loved one, or times of fear, somebody's in the hospital and they're facing surgery and they're unsure of things, and those moments with them are truly holy moments and great opportunities, I think, for us to see God working in the world and through us. One of the most powerful experiences that I had in my ministry was many years ago when there was a young couple who was just kind of barely connected to the church. I think they'd attended worship once and somehow they thought of this as their church, but I didn't really have much of a relationship with them until they called and asked me to do a funeral for their baby that had been born and lived 2 days. And they invited me into their home, and we talked about all the hope and all the dreams of them having this child and what a horrible loss this was. And then we did a graveside service together, and it was just this really powerful, sad time to be with a family, and it had such a deep impact on me. But then about a year and a half later, they called me again, and they said, "We know we haven't been in church, but we have good news. We've had a child, and the child is 3 months old, and he's healthy, and we would love for you to baptize this child." And so they began to come to worship, and we did the baptism. And I'll never forget that moment when I had this practice of baptizing a baby and then holding the child up and kind of walking through the congregation with the mother, just say, "I want you to meet so-and-so, your new sister in Christ," or whatever. And I remember that. And everybody in the community knew that this young family had lost their first child. And just walking through the congregation and tears just pouring down everyone's face because it was such a powerful moment. And so it's those kinds of holy, sacred moments. It's just such a privilege for us to walk with people during those times. So those are the things that I think about as I think back on my ministry as a pastor.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, yeah, to be invited into those moments is certainly a holy privilege. I loved what you shared about the especially with your youth ministry and seeing the adults mature in their faith. That's we don't often think of youth ministry that way. We think of youth ministry as Harry, Larry, and Mary, and they're all in high school, and you just got to keep them occupied for a while. And but no, they have guardians and parents, and that also need to mature. Friends, we are with Reverend David Maslin, the Director of New Faith Communities in the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church. I guess my next question, Dave, is can you take us to the journey of the New Faith Communities and that ministry? How did that? Where does that fit along the spectrum here?
Yeah, as you mentioned at the very beginning, I did serve after I served as a pastor for 19 years. I was a district superintendent for 7, and basically for those that are non-United Methodists, that means I oversaw 50 pastors in about 75 churches for 7 years. And I have to say, as meaningful it was, a lot of that work was, the most meaningful thing I did in those years was walk alongside a young woman who came to me one day and said, "I feel like God's calling me to plant a new church, and here's why, and who we're going to try to reach," and those kind of things. And I just began to work with her and meet with her. Her name was Annette Snedeker, and some people that listen to this may know Annette and her family. Began to meet with her regularly every other week or so, and we'd pray together. And I, as a superintendent, I knew nothing about church planting at that time. She was learning, she was getting some training, she had a coach, and she and I would sit and talk. And that journey, walking with her, planting that new church, was an extremely meaningful, difficult, challenging, wonderful experience. And so because of that experience, about 10 years ago, our new Upper New York Conference was forming. There were parts of 4 different conferences that came together, as you know, and part of the vision of the new conference was to, one of the three main things we wanted to do together was plant new churches. So I volunteered to be on a team that was forming the plan for planting what we were going to do in the new conference, and actually helped write a job description for a director of New Faith Communities, and we interviewed some people, and I was actually the person who brought our recommendation. After interviewing three people, we brought a recommendation to the bishop, and I said, we think this is the right person for the job. And the bishop just paused for a second, said, "No, Dave, I don't think we found the right person yet." I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "We can go back and interview some more." And he said, "No," he said, "I think I'm sitting with the person that should be doing this job." And I had not even applied. I had no intention to apply for the job. But he asked me to prayerfully consider it, and I did, and talked to my wife, and ended up saying yes 7.5 years ago. So that was kind of how I got into this, and it was certainly something I was passionate about. And the main reason the bishop asked me to do it was because so many people knew me and knew how passionate I was about this, and I had worked with so many people already planting. That he felt the trust was there. The conference trusted me. And so it was a great opportunity. And since then, I have talked to 200 different people that have felt called to plant New Faith Communities. And over 150 of those people have actually tried some experiments. And New Faith Communities are all different kinds, all different strategies. Most of them have been planted by existing churches. Many of them are designed to reach people that are, Hispanic or African American. People often, Dave, we have 800 churches. Why do we need more? Why are we planting more? And my answer is always not to have more churches, but to reach the people that our churches, existing churches, are not already reaching. And as you know, every church kind of have its own culture and reaches a particular kind of person. And as much as churches want to think everybody's welcome here, of course, everybody of all kinds can come. The fact is, our churches do kind of attract certain types of people. And so if we're not intentional about reaching groups of people that are not in our churches, we'll probably never reach them. So that's why we do it. And the other thing I would say is that has just blown me away is how much God's Spirit is putting dreams and visions within people to plant New Faith Communities. It hasn't been my action that has planted any church. It has been the vision of people, God's people, these dreams that God has put within them to create a new kind of a faith community, to reach a certain group of people that they kind of have on their hearts. And so, from my perspective, it is God's Spirit that is driving this movement. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Prior to our time together here this morning, I jumped on the conference website and hit New Faith Communities, and just to see the number of new faith communities that are identified and such is very, very impressive. I was sitting at that annual conference when you cast that dream, and you could have heard a pin drop as to, wow, how are we going to do this? And I think you're very clear. We do it by God's Spirit. There's no doubt about that. So that is wonderful. I guess as we kind of wind down here, I would be real interested to hear your response to this. What's your hope for the church as we move through this time of pandemic and perhaps schism and all of that? What's your hope for the church as you enter into retirement?
Yeah, so I think my hope for the church is not survival, but that there will be thriving faith communities that provide for people the community that they need. So I think that, there's a lot of things we're learning during this COVID pandemic, right?
Yeah.
One of them is that, in fact, the church doesn't stop just because we can't be in a building. Our churches in our culture are very building centric. They have been, at least in the past. And as much as church people have wanted to be back in the building, one of the things we learned is, the church didn't stop. Churches continued to gather online, continued to stay connected in small groups. And so, I would say in the future, I would expect that there will always be the church, because it is God's church. It's not ours. So people are going to figure it out, but it'll probably look very different.
Yeah.
The church will, I think, be less clergy centric and more driven, like it was in the beginning, by laity. The United Methodist Church is a movement in America. We have so many churches because laity planted them, not because clergy did.
Right.
And clergy just came alongside and,
Yes.
started traveling around to meet the needs of all the churches that had jumped up. So I really think that there will always be a church.
Yep.
That people are right now innovating what the future church will be and trying out different ways of being the church. And I think there'll be a lot of variety in the way churches look.
Amen. Yeah.
But there'll always be a church.
Yeah, Dave, and I thank you for being a part of that foundation as we move forward. So thank you so much for taking this opportunity. I could do 4 more shows with you, and I appreciate it. So brothers and sisters, I hope that this has been a time of blessing. We thank the Reverend David Maslin for being our guest today on the Encounter program. Have a blessed day and know that you are loved. God bless.